Good morning, everyone, and sorry that once again we are meeting via Zoom. I hope this will be our last such occasion, and that we'll be able to resume live and via Zoom from next week, once COVID has finally cleared itself out of my family. I wanted to do a little bit of tidying up of some of the points that we discussed last week, based upon various questions that were raised with me during the course of the week, and perhaps to clarify some points. So we were looking at the influence of culture and science and philosophy and history at the time on the form that the Torah SheBichtav takes. And as I explained in previous weeks, the core values and message of the Torah SheBichtav is clearly above human contingent conditions. Nonetheless, the circumstances and the manner through which it expresses itself does, to some degree or other, appear to be affected by circumstances at the time, even if it's as trivial as the halachic mechanism through which, the laws of damages are expressed, being through the circumstances of how an ox might gore a cow, as opposed to a modern example that we might give. But then we looked at how this is taken further, and in particular we were looking at the ideas of the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, his guide to the perplexed, in which he speaks about even very core and central mitzvahs being given to us, Klal Yisrael, as a means to rid ourselves of something prevalent at the time. And he says this about many of the chukim, which he believes are not statutes in the sense of being inexplicable, ununderstandable, having no explanation, but they're not mishpatim in the sense that they don't, in and of in themselves, represent something obvious and intuitive to us human beings, but they are dealing with ridding ourselves of the endemic and all prevalent and pervasive pagan influences, and therefore this is something very central to our avodas Hashem, to move away from these practices. And even something as central as korbanos, as sacrifices, might, in a sense, merely be there as a way of ridding ourselves of these terrible influences. I say merely in the sense that these are central to the Torah values. The Torah believes it is absolutely vital to rid ourselves of the influence of Avodah Zarah, but in and of in themselves, they are there to remove a problem rather than fundamentally being an intrinsic and essential and absolute method of avodas Hashem, and we looked at the criticism of the Ramban and others of this view. Now, I want to stress that there's no doubt that this is a minority opinion. The Rambam, as in so many other things, definitely found himself in the minority. I'm not here arguing that this is a mainstream approach amongst the Rishonim Acharonim. I'm simply saying that this is the view of the Rambam, and this view helps answer and understand many questions. And for those that engage with these matters, the view of the Rambam, as in so many other areas, is a helpful and useful and enlightening one that gives us a spiritually meaningful pathway to a lot of these challenges. Now, I was asked to summarize the two readings I gave in the Rambam last week, and therefore I will start with that just to try and clarify this. The simpler reading, or the less controversial reading in the Rambam, the one that aligns with the simplest idea that he expresses in his Ikrim, in his 13 fundamentals of faith, in particular Ikates, the 9th principle in which he says the Torah will never be altered, is that the Rambam doesn't mean to say that korbanos will someday cease. Rather, what he means to say is that the purpose of korbanos is to rid humans of this drift and tendency towards paganism, and perhaps this drift is something which is fundamental to human nature and will remain for all time. Even in Yemos Mashiach, we will still need that method of reminding ourselves that we do not, despite the seeming multiplicity of the world, we do not live in a world with multiple forces, but we live in a world in which behind it all is a unified force, the force of monotheism of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, what does this mean to say? It means to say that even in Yemos Mashiach, we will have temptations to veer off. We will still have free will. What will the difference be? As the Rambam explains, that the world will be full of knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we will therefore engage in a pure avodas Hashem, but maybe part of that avodas Hashem will be continued practices to embed within ourselves and our consciousnesses and remind ourselves not to drift towards avodah zarah, not to drift towards paganism. And therefore, the Rambam doesn't mean to suggest that this mitzvah will ever cease. He simply is explaining that the origin of the mitzvah is removing that which is debased and lesser within us, rather than and defeating paganism, rather than any more fundamental approach to our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, I recognize this approach poses difficulties. Will this indeed still be necessary at the time of Moshiach? Surely we will have permanently ruptured any temptation of paganism by that time. I mean, now do we face a temptation of paganism? Maybe not paganism, but certainly still a temptation to remove the physical world and universe we exist from godliness and transcendence. But will this indeed carry on at the time of Mashiach? And the problem is, these questions are hard to answer, but the Rambam says what he says. He tells us that this is the purpose of Korbanos. He says this is what he understands Korbanos to be, and therefore we are caught in the horns of a dilemma. Either the Rambam means to say that the sacrificial practice will continue after Mashiach, in which case he believes this method of avodas Hashem is still necessary, or he believes this will cease, eventually at least, in which case we need to understand what the ninth ikka means, in which it says no mitzvah will cease to be. And therefore we are led on to the second reading of the Rambam, which is the approach that, as far as I understand, Nachum Rabinovich states, in which he suggests that eventually Korbanos will cease, and this need not bother us. This isn't a contradiction to the eternity of mitzvahs, because they are not ceasing because the mitzvah has changed. They are not ceasing because Hashem has removed this mitzvah, but they are ceasing because the mitzvah has achieved its culmination, it has achieved its goals. And this idea is almost expressed by the Rambam himself, as I mentioned in his introduction to his book of mitzvahs, his Sefer HaMitzvahs, his book of Korbanos, in which he says, I only list amongst the Torah of mitzvahs, the 613 mitzvahs, eternal mitzvahs, not mitzvahs which are temporary. The mitzvah not to ascend Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah, is not one of the 613 commandments, because it was only a temporary mitzvah for the time. I only list eternal mitzvahs, but eternal mitzvahs doesn't mean that they will always apply. It's possible the mitzvah will reach its culmination, its fulfillment, and then the mitzvah will no longer be applicable. But this is an eternal mitzvah, because it's not that the mitzvah was only for a time. The mitzvah was there until the mitzvah was fulfilled, till the kiyum happens, till the fulfillment of the mitzvah happens. Once the kiyum, the fulfillment of the mitzvah happens, then the mitzvah is no longer applicable, because it's happened, it's been fulfilled. But this doesn't make this a temporary mitzvah, this is an eternal mitzvah. And something like that would be how the Rambam understood Korbanos. That what perhaps, according to this reason, that once Korbanos have fulfilled their aim, the obligation no longer applies. This is explicit, for example, in the midst of Mechias Amalek, destroying and nullifying Amalek. This is an eternal mitzvah. This is listed amongst the 613 on the one hand. And on the other hand, once Amalek is destroyed, the mitzvah ceases to exist, as again we hope will occur in the Yemos HaMashiach at the time of Mashiach. So these are the two readings. The Rambam, to summarize, option number one, the mitzvah, it would find practical fulfillment for all time. And therefore the Rambam is merely saying that this reflects an eternal human tendency to drift towards paganism. And therefore in practice, we would always bring Korbanos, perhaps therefore reconfiguring how we understand Yemos HaMashiach. Alternative number two is that the practical application of this mitzvah will indeed eventually cease. At some stage, we will grow beyond the need for Korbanos. And nonetheless, this doesn't contradict an eternal Torah, because it's the cancellation of mitzvahs because of its fulfillment, not because of its cessation. So these are the two readings. Just the maths of the Rambam leads us to these two readings, even though I acknowledge and recognize that both readings come with challenges. And again, I repeat what I said in my introduction. This is not a mainstream view. This is the minority opinion of the Rambam, but one that deserves consideration. We need to adopt a stance of modesty in trying to understand the Rambam, because we are dealing with Ikrim, with the ninth Ikka, and therefore I think remaining somewhat tentative in our reading is an appropriate response. We also don't know how to answer all the questions on the Rambam. There are things that remain unknown in the Rambam. Our tefillah connected Korbanos that we nowadays engage in, is this because this is a substitute for bringing the Korbanos? Since we still live in a world tempted by paganism, doesn't mean there will be a restoration of Korbanos when Mashiach comes for a time until we eventually grow beyond these concepts. Did the Rambam mean this for all sacrifices, or is he distinguishing between sacrifices pre-Matan Torah and post-Matan Torah, as per the claim of the Meshech Chachma, Rabbi Zobin. There are many questions around the view of the Rambam. I think for now the Rambam I think we've analysed the Rambam enough, and the Rambam is an important an important foundation stone for pursuing many of these matters, in which the Rambam says, yes, it is acceptable to understand certain mitzvahs as reflecting a response to the values of the time. Chiddush number 1 of the Rambam. Chiddush number 2 of the Rambam, it is possible there are values which the Torah abhors, it dislikes, and yet it doesn't immediately ban them because it wouldn't succeed in its goal, in its aim, and it needs to slowly ease humanity in a certain direction, akin to the midrashic reading that the Rambam gives. We couldn't leave Egypt and immediately go to the land of Israel. We weren't ready for it. God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the giver of the Torah, is all able and is above time and space. But we, the human recipients of the Torah, are not all able. We're not above time and space, and therefore it takes time for us to change and develop and improve. And therefore, the Torah builds a system which will eventually, over time, lead us to the correct values and correct way of being. Eventually, within us will be embedded that which the Torah wants, but this takes time and isn't instantaneous. And therefore, it's possible that there are mitzvahs in the Torah which reflect values of the time, and a shift away from them, a developmental curve towards movement away from these. Now, this opens another can of worms, because if indeed we feel the values of the Torah are open for review, what does this mean? Does this mean that there could be cancellation of mitzvahs? Does this mean there could be changes to the values of the Torah? Does it mean the values are not in and of themselves universal? And these are indeed good questions on the Rambam, and matters that we need to treat with care and precaution. We certainly can't take any passing fad of values and assume that this value is correct, chas v'shalom, and that the value of the Torah now needs to be rejigged to conform with this. This certainly isn't what the Rambam is saying. The Rambam is saying that there are values that are integral to the Torah itself, values which reflect what the Torah itself teaches us, and it's these values which will find expression over time through the direction that the mitzvahs lead us. In addition, these values are not meant to lead to kula, to leniency, but in a sense, to lead to chumrah, to stringency. We're meant to enhance and grow in our relationship to the values of the Torah, rather than diminish those. So someone who would argue in the removal of a prohibition in the Torah based upon current political correctness or modern day so-called values, this certainly would not be in line with the thought of the Rambam. This isn't what the Rambam is suggesting chas v'shalom in the least. I want to perhaps just give a couple of further examples of these ideas of the Rambam as applied by more recent thinkers. And I will take 2 examples of these and mention them briefly, because both of them I have discussed on other occasions. And the first is the stance of Rav Kook around vegetarianism, because Rav Kook really argues something very similar to the Rambam, even though to the best of my knowledge he does not quote this Rambam explicitly. And Rav Kook wrote a booklet, a kuntres, on the copy of a kuntres on the issue of vegetarianism, and he also wrote a letter or 2 around the subject. And Rav Kook was of the belief that the Torah allowance for us to eat meat is not an ideal, but is a b'diavad, an accommodation to human weakness. And therefore, in a sense, very akin to the view of the Rambam. He says the Torah, when it says that we can be meat eaters, is not reflecting an ideal. It's reflecting an okay standard. It's okay to eat meat as long as we have various precautions in place. The halachas of tzar ba'alei chayim, not to impose unnecessary cruelty on animals. The halachas of shechita, which impose a certain method of slaughter. Treifa, which maintain a standard of life for the animal, and therefore resultant necessary healthcare to ensure the animal is kept in conditions which will ensure it remains healthy. Avoidance of cruelty to animals, the limitations of kashrus, milk and meat, and other halachas which ensure that we are conscious when we eat meat of the privilege of so doing. But ultimately, this isn't an ideal. This is a reluctant acquiescence to the Torah to this. In other words, in Rav Kook's thinking, we shouldn't view the Torah as always setting the highest standard of behavior, we should view the Torah setting an okay standard of behavior, a basic bar or level of morality, and one which is true and applicable and okay to the human condition. And this is, in a sense, a familiar concept. Again, we are used to the idea of hidur or mitzvah, of beautifying the mitzvah, taking the fulfillment of the mitzvah beyond the basic level the Torah sets it. We're used to the concept of chumrah, of going lifnim mashur asatin, of going beyond the letter of the law in interpersonal relationships, in dinei mominus, of chumrah in beinot and makom, of an enhanced stringency in our practice of beinot and makom. We are used to Kabbalistic ways of serving Hashem, which take us beyond the norm that is expected in halachic practice, to midat chasidut, to ways of piety and righteousness, whether they were practiced by the Hasidic movement amongst the family of the Rambam, Rabbi Zobin ben Rambam, whether the Spanish movement under Rabbi Yonah, whether the Hasidei Ashkenaz, Rabbi Yoda Chassid in the medieval period, whether later Hasidus, the Baal Shem Tov, whether the Hasidus found in the non-Hasidic world of the students of the Vilna Gaon. The concept of Hasidus, the idea of a piety and a practice beyond the letter of the law, these are all familiar concepts. So we're used to the idea that the Torah can say something is permitted, and nonetheless, we humans can adopt a stance of chumrah or piety beyond that which the Torah says, or positive practices beyond that which the Torah requires of us, and that this is appropriate to do. The minimum amount of charity may be maaseh, a tenth, and yet one can give a 20th. Truma may be a tithe given to the Kohen that can be any quantity, and yet we can be machmeh to give more than that. Benching may be a Torah obligation only when we are satiated, and nonetheless, Chazal can tell us to be stringent and even bench after we've only had a kazayis or a kabetza. So the idea of rabbinic legislation, practice that developed, minhag that takes us beyond the letter of the law is not a controversial one. And therefore, Cook argues that similarly, vegetarianism may reflect a value, an enhanced value beyond the values of the Torah, and yet one that is appropriate in principle to be a Jewish value. Why does the Torah allow it? Really very similar to the thought of the Rambam, because this is what's appropriate to most humans. For most humans, it would be too hard to adopt this practice. Perhaps it wouldn't be healthy to do so, and therefore the Torah doesn't mandate it. Rav Kook is also open to the possibility that the Torah discourages it. He says perhaps there are moral advantages in consuming animals, for example, so that we never forget the difference between the human and the animal. Perhaps if we were to cease eating animals, we would forget the fundamental difference between human and animal. And therefore, this is an acknowledgement and an acceptance of the weakness of us human beings, that we are allowed to eat meat, maybe even encouraged to be meat, and nonetheless, this doesn't reflect an absolute eternal value. So what these sorts of parallel thoughts of the Rambam in his Guide to the Perplexed and Rav Kook in a very different essay are leading us towards is a more nuanced picture of what Torah is. It does reflect, in essence, of course, eternal values, but nonetheless, the halachic expression of these eternal values may involve compromise. They may involve compromise due to the weakness of human condition, due to the state of human beings at the time of Matan Torah, and the circumstances and culture and insight, and we'll see later, even scientific knowledge available to humans at the time. The Torah should be viewed as a chinuch book of sorts, a book of direction, of hurrah, that directs us and moves us towards the final values, but the starting point may reflect the conditions of the Dor of the generation at the time of Matan Torah and the circumstances around that time. So this is a commonality between the thoughts of both Rav Kook and the Moreh Nevuchim in this area. And Rav Kook does discuss somewhat what will happen to karbonos at the time of the Moshiach. Will animal sacrifices continue forever, or will we revert to vegetarian sacrifices once we human beings are able to move towards vegetarian practice, which he believes is an ideal? And he says maybe the bringing of karbonos is only applicable. So I'm just apologies, someone just knocking at my door in my office. Can someone remind me where we were up to?
may have vegetarian korbanos in the
Yes,
time.
thank you. Yes, so Rav Kook is open to the suggestion that it may be that the sacrifices of that the time of Matan Torah. Sorry, forgive me, I'm distracted a little. Rav Kook is open to the suggestion that the korbanos may eventually move to vegetarian versions. That the reason for the bringing of korbanos as meat offerings is reflecting the centrality of meat and the animal in the human condition as it currently is. But when we move and elevate and arrive at a more elevated stance above and beyond the consumption of meat, then similarly sacrifices and korbanos will move away from the meat korbanos. Again, how does this reflect the Ikar Tashi, the ninth fundamental of faith? Their mitzvahs won't change. Rav Kook doesn't directly address it, but it seems it would be akin to the same idea that the practice of korbanos will morph and adapt itself to our new circumstances due to the culmination and fulfillment of the mitzvah, the kiyum of the mitzvah, rather than its cessation, rather than it being nullified, which indeed would contradict this principle. Rav Kook famously is medayik, the language of the tefillah, in which we say, when we daven for the restoration of korbanos, v'orva Hashem minchas Yehuda, that the mincha offering of Yehuda should be sweet, should be pleasant to Hashem, with the restoration of the Beis Mikdash. The mincha, of course, is a vegetarian carbon. It's flour and oil and the like, rather than being meat carbon. And therefore he says, perhaps this is what is meant. Again, I want to stress these are certainly minority views in our tradition. These are not the consensus view. And again, we need to adopt these with a modesty and attentiveness, because they approach Ikrei Hadas, because they approach really fundamentals of faith. Nonetheless, these are voices that should be heard and which perhaps speak to us in some of us in our attempt to understand some of these ideas. We've posted a number of questions on the side. Given that our standards started with Avraham Avinu and passed down through the family, why did we need to be weaned off any pagan practices? When did we start with them? There's a question that's posted here. Surely when we started with Avraham, we had no pagan practices. Well, the answer is not so simple. We say in our Gadol, our ancestors were originally idol worshippers. We descended from idol worshippers. This lingering impact on Avraham's ancestry, the Haggadah seems to suggest, and this is how Chazal understood the concept of the bris bein habasorim, the covenant of the parts that we read a couple of weeks ago in Parshas Lech Lecha, that Avram, even Avram and his descendants were somewhat influenced by their surroundings and therefore needed time to be weaned off this. Avram Avinu himself, of course, rid himself of any such influences, but that doesn't mean that we were completely immune to the surroundings within which we lived. Chazal bring the quote of the Yam Suf, of the Sorah Shaliyam, when the Yam Suf was told to split. He says, why should I split for the Jews? These and they are idol worshippers, are pagans. By that point, the Jews had adopted the pagan practices of Egypt. They remained, according to one version of Chazal, they didn't change their names, their dress code, their language, but nonetheless they've been influenced by Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah is prevalent. We read the stories in Yeshua, in Shoftim, in Malachim, a constant drift towards Avodah Zarah and a constant need for the Nevi'im to remind Klal Yisrael of this ever-prevalent danger. We were not, unfortunately, immune from Avodah Zarah, despite our foundations. Avraham Avinu, of course, personally ridding himself of this completely, but nonetheless, with Chila Avodah Zarah, a lingering effect of our ancestry and the surroundings affecting us. Does Rav Kook refer to fish? I was asked again in the chat. As far as I recollect, no, I don't have a copy of Rav Kook here in front of me, but as far as I remember, no, he doesn't. Again, perhaps an interesting discussion, why not? So this is one extension, if you like, of the Moreh Nevuchim's ideas, though to the best of my recollection, Rav Kook doesn't mention explicitly the Moreh Nevuchim. I may be wrong on that, I need to double check, but this is a sort of akin or parallel idea of Rav Kook. Another example of this is that of Rav Sachs, which again I've mentioned on several occasions, and I happened to mention most recently in my Wednesday night Parsha share. It's as far as I understand, and I've read, this idea actually comes from Rav Sachs' rabbi in these matters, again, Rav Nachman Rabinovitz, I mentioned last week. And he speaks again about the cessation of slavery and the Torah allowing slavery, albeit in a very circumscribed and limited manner. And if we look at the halachos of slavery, the Torah puts an enormous protection for slaves. When we're talking about Eved Ivri, of course, the slavery is limited to a period of 6 years. An Eved Ivri has to be treated to the highest standards, to the same standards of life of the family of the master. When it comes to an Eved Kanani is yoked of a shein v'ayin. If a Eved Kanani is injured by the master, they go free. There's a standard expected of the treatment of an Eved Kanani. And nonetheless, after all of this, slavery is still slavery. It still involves enslavement of a human being, the loss of freedom and dignity, the separation, rupture of families. Surely this is a terrible thing. And one approach to this, as expressed by Menachem Rabinovitz and Sachs, is that indeed the Torah is acknowledging and accepting the existence of slavery, because at the time this was the norm. To have removed slavery completely would paradoxically have had the opposite effect. It would have taken away human free will. It would have moved Klal Yisrael beyond that which they were capable of conceiving and living. Living in a surrounding in which slavery was the norm might have ruptured their economy, the whole possible functioning of the state. Maybe indeed would have led to worse conditions for slaves, because Jews wouldn't have been able to be on the market for slaves at all, and therefore slaves would have ended up under other masters who would have treated them far worse. And therefore the Torah acknowledges, perhaps somewhat reluctantly, and accepts the existence of slavery, but it builds halachas in to ensure that a Jewish owner of a slave never forgets the fundamental human dignity of the slave, such that over time, we Jews and the world ultimately will come to recognize the horror of slavery, how this is a terrible perversion of Tzelem Elokim, and therefore ultimately rid ourselves of the concept of slavery, as indeed has proven the case. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the giver of the Torah, is all-powerful, and with one stroke of his metaphorical pen could have rid us of slavery, but we recipients of the Torah would not have learned from that the dignity of human beings. On the contrary, it would have diminished our dignity and our independence, because it would have been a divine diktat that we wouldn't have been able to relate to, wouldn't have been able to accept. It would have reduced our freedom, and therefore ultimately reduced the respect that is given to human beings. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to create a world in which humans respect each other, in which the master respects the slave, in which the king respects his people, and therefore Hashem, as our ultimate Lord and Master, is going to do no less to his people. He's not going to disrespect us by imposing on us a value which is beyond us, and to do so would diminish human dignity, diminish our understanding of the value of life, would have made us harsher and less aware of the respect that we owe others, and therefore a process is set into motion, a slow process in which we are nudged towards recognition of this value, so that we arrive at it as ourselves, and therefore we ourselves are able to fulfill this mitzvah. We ourselves are able to arrive at this value and recognize the Tzelem Elokim, the ultimate importance of every human being, and therefore the horror that lies behind the acceptance of this. So argues Reb Menachem Rabinovitz, Rabbi Sachs, in understanding Avdus and slavery. And I've just very briefly summarized their thoughts on this matter because I have discussed it on other occasions. Again, I'm not saying this is the only approach or the mainstream approach, but this is certainly an approach to these issues, which is an important one to understand. Are there sources in Chazal for these ideas? Again, I think very much so. And the prime example of this, which again I'll mention briefly because we touched it when we looked at morality in the Torah, is that of Yefas Toya, the concept that a beautiful captive, a beautiful enemy who has gone out to war in the supporting camp of the enemy soldiers and is captured in battle, may be kept by the Jewish soldier who captures her and ultimately become his wife. Now again, this halacha seems very counter to Torah values. How on earth can such a thing exist? And Chazal say, "Lo dibur Torah l'keneged Yetzirah." The Torah is speaking against the Yetzirah. Had the Torah prohibited completely any such practices, it would have been impossible to keep in the heat of battle in a world in which the group accompanying soldiers into battle included beautiful women, and these were seen as legitimate, somewhat legitimate booty and spoils of war, and perhaps were even brought along to distract the soldiers and distract the enemies in a world in which a testosterone world of battle and fighting, in which even to this day it is recognized that soldiers in the battle rage, in the red mist of anger, and so on, are to some degree less culpable for their actions. A complete prohibition wouldn't have been possible, and therefore the Torah does something else. It allows it, in order to reassure the soldier there is a route forward if you are able to exercise some self-control, and then prescribes and limits and prohibits how this is expressed. The soldier has to give the space to give Torah, to mourn for her family for 30 days. She is then given the choice. If she is willing to convert to Judaism, she can become the wife of the soldier, perhaps not such a bad thing given that she's a captive. If she refuses conversion, they continue negotiating and pressing for 12 months, after which she has to go free. If he treats her any less than a regular wife, he is in breach of the Torah. She has to have the full privileges and respect of a regular wife, and all the associated halachas designed to, on the one hand, allow the soldier to enter into such a relationship, and on the other hand, remind him that this is a human being who is protected, and lo divra Torah ela k'neged yetzer hara. That means to say Chazal already felt able, and I'm using therefore this as a sort of a springboard or a metaphor, foundation for these ideas. Chazal already felt able to look at something which the Torah says is permitted and say, but this is terrible. This is against all the values of the Torah. How on earth can this be allowed? Surely it's not possible that the Torah is saying this is b'chatchila, this is an ideal. This is simply the Torah reluctantly accommodating and acquiescing to something, because to prohibit it would not be meaningful and possible and realistic, given not the giver of the Torah, who is unlimited and all-powerful, but the recipients of the Torah, us, who are limited and of limited ability to change. And therefore the Torah allows something which is not an ideal, but inherent in that idea of Chazal would be the concept that perhaps if we are able to move away from this and move beyond it, that would be a good outcome and a positive achievement. So to summarize what we've said, the thinkers really relating from Chazal in Yifas Torah to the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim, to Rav Kook, and on to Nachum Rabinovitz and Rav Sachs, speak about the idea that the Torah was addressing the human condition at the time. It's a Torah molded not just to the giver of the Torah and his absolute divine will, but to the recipient of the Torah and our ability. And to some degree, our standards and our abilities are affected by the circumstances that the Jewish people found themselves in at the time of the giving of the Torah. So this is, I hope, some clarification in the ideas that I expressed last week, which left some of my questioners a little disturbed. I want to use the remaining time to revisit another aspect which left some questions afterwards, and this is around the reliance upon archaeological research and the Mishkan, the camp of Ramses II, that was found in the relief found in Abu Simbel, which I mentioned last week. And I'll just very briefly share my screen just to remind you of this. You should be able to just see very briefly the relief which I shared with you last week, and the parallel between the camp of Ramses II and the Mishkan, which you can see at the bottom of the page, the sketch diagram which really shows the relief as it existed, and we discussed this last week. So I was asked about the permissibility or otherwise of looking at these archaeological research and how we as from Jews are meant to relate to them, and whether indeed we should engage in them at all. So I want to say several things around this. I'm certainly no advocate for engaging in these matters or for learning and studying biblical criticism, which is very problematic. Not least because it is written with great conviction and certainty by the researchers, often making claims way above and beyond what the historical evidence really shows. And unless one really analyzes these sources very, very critically and with great care and looks at the evidence that's being proposed, it's often very uncertain whether the claims being made reach beyond or not what their evidence really shows. And this is a very serious issue. It's also exceptionally hard to do for the layman, and it's even hard to do for the historian, because there's a vast array of expertise that's needed. One needs to understand archaeology and development of language and linguistics and dating methods, both those built on physics like carbon dating and dating methods built on archaeological layers and on the development of culture. And one needs to really know how to know what research around ancient Ugaritic and the languages that are around at the time. It's an exceptionally complicated field with a lot of claims made around it which really aren't justified. So I'm certainly not an advocate for engaging in these matters. Nonetheless, many of us do so engage, and therefore I think it's appropriate for, in the context of a shir, to explore what one can say around these things. And this Mishkan story really presents a Musa lesson in how distorted, I'm afraid to say, sometimes the approach of the biblical critics can be in these areas. And I think one has to be careful before one labels those with whom one disagrees dishonest, but certainly very troubling, the sort of double game they play. And if one looks at the history of sort of research into the Mishkan, it's a very classic example. If you look at the end of the 19th century, following the influential work of Wellhausen and Graff and the like, they argued that after the return from the Golos Bovel, there was this priestly source which wanted to emphasize the significance of the Mishkan and the sacrificial of the sacrificial cult and the role of the Kohanim and the Leviim, and therefore they invented a portable Mishkan, a portable sanctuary to serve Klal Yisrael, and they dated it back to the time of Moshe and Aaron in the wilderness. Now, the reason they said this is because they said there's no model for that could have inspired the design of the Mishkan as a center of worship for Klal Yisrael, even though we find many Botei Mikdash-like temples to Avodah Zarah, some of them indeed with floor plans somewhat similar to the Beis Hamikdash. We don't find anywhere a desert Mishkan, a portable Mishkan at all. So they claimed. And therefore they said this is a fictional shrine invented for various needs. Now, already at this point, we ought to be sort of ringing alarm bells about this claim, because this will enter the academic literature as a claim that therefore there's historical doubt about the Mishkan and reason to believe that it's an invention. But there's a sort of begging of the question that takes place here. If you assume that the only innovations of the Jewish people can have occurred because of influence and mimicry and copying of the surrounding cultures, if you assume that, then it must be that the Mishkan is a post facto invention. Because since we don't find surrounding cultures that have a portable temple, the Mishkan itself, therefore, must be an ahistoric invention. And this is sort of begging the question, because there's an alternative model. Maybe Klal Yisrael created their own mode of spiritual service, as given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore there isn't a surrounding culture example of this. But nonetheless, this is nonetheless something that occurred. So it's only ahistorical because you believe that it has to exist within history and have been influenced by the Phoenicians and by surrounding cultures in order for it to have occurred. Since then, however, actually the evidence around this was built has crumbled, because there's now an enormous amount of evidence that there were portable Mishkan-like structures floating around the ancient Near East around the time of the giving of the Torah. In Ugarit, there's the evidence of the Canaanite god El, who lived in a tent, and this tent is referred to in Ugarit, which is a sort of a Semitic tongue, using the Aleph Hey Lamed root. And it's even referred to as a Mishkan, the same roots as the Mishkan. It's even referred to as the Mishkan, with very similar language used. We saw again the Abu Simbel relief, which suggests that that this was something that was used by the Egyptians as a device to talk about the military tent camp of their kings, of Ramses II. And in fact, the closest archaeological parallel, there's many, I should mention, I've just given something, there's many archaeological parallels from the time. Several texts from about 3,800 years ago mention tents which were collected up. I'm talking about a text called Murray, which was in Mesopotamia. I'm talking about in Egypt itself, many parallels to this. In the cave, in the burial chamber of Tutankhamun, a tent hung above it. There's the tent of Hathor, which was a goddess, an Egyptian goddess who had a tent shrine dedicated, and many other such tent shrines, which were dedicated at the time to the gods. But the closest parallel, as I mentioned, found about 100 years ago, was the military tent of Ramses, which is camp in Qodesh, which looks exactly like the Mishkan in terms of the setup, and with its courtyard structure. Both structures have these sort of rectangular courtyards. Both seem to orientate towards the east. It's not clear. Both are twice as long as they're wide. In the camp's middle is an entrance with a long tent with a ratio of 3:1, composed of 2, which is the main tent, and then 1, which is the inner tent, the Kodesh Kedoshim, the inner sanctuary, in which is found the throne of Ramses, Paro's chamber, or in our version, the Kodesh Kedoshim, and so on and so forth. And even the encampments on all 4 sides, very akin to the way army divisions on all 4 sides, parallel to how in Sefer Bamidbar, we're told Klal Yisrael traveled through the desert with the encampment on all 4 sides. So there's an incredible similarity of this. And again, we understand the Rambam already told us that the Karbonos, on some level, adopted the manners of worship used at the time, and it wouldn't be surprising that if we create something to demonstrate the Malchus, the kingship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can understand in the Rambam's thinking why this would be modelled on the parallel systems of kingship. I mean, we do this again in our Avodas Hashem to this day. If we want to make a shul magnificent, if the shul is located in the east, it would have been built in the design of magnificent buildings in the east, and if it was located in the west, it would have magnificent design in the west, and if it's modernity, it might have chandeliers and marble pillars and the like. And the way we glorify and bring beauty to the Avodas Hashem is exactly that, by copying the design at the time. So how has biblical criticism dealt with this incredible change to what the historical methods, to their claim that we find no parallel to the Mishkan in ancient history? Well, you'll be surprised to know that it doesn't mean that they've questioned their conclusions. All they now say is, well, we've found a parallel to the Mishkan, and therefore this is yet further evidence that the Torah is simply influenced by the surrounding culture and doesn't carry within it Chas v'Shalom, the Dvar Hashem, the message of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if there's no parallel found to the Mishkan, we will doubt its authenticity. And if there is a parallel found to the Mishkan, we'll say, oh, so it's just reflecting the parallelism of the time. In other words, it's a lose-lose situation. No matter which evidence is found, we will lose the, no matter which evidence is found. If there's a lack of parallel, it means it's an invention of Ezra and the post-Golos Bavel period. If there is a parallel, it means it's simply cutting and pasting and influenced by the times. And there's a lose-lose around this. More than that, in fact, the finding of the parallel is evidence of the historicity of the Torah. Because if the Torah is a later written document, perhaps written at the time of the Bayis Sheni, who on earth at the time knew about Abu Simbel? Who on earth knew about practices dating back more than 1,500 years, and how Egyptians at the time, how Ramses' palace looked like, Ramses' palace looked like, or what the tent structure that was built called Olam Mishkan in ancient Mesopotamia, in Ugarit. Who on earth knew about these terms? So if we find the Torah giving a description of a Mishkan, ascribing it back to the time of Matan Torah, 3,500 years ago, exactly around the time where Ramses had a parallel structure, if this is used to indicate the structure, to parallel the structure of the Mishkan, this doesn't give evidence of the divinity of the Torah, but it certainly gives evidence of the historicity of the Torah and the dating of these descriptions back to the first dawn of Klal Yisrael, to the creation of Klal Yisrael. So I hope that tidies up some of the questions from last time. I believe that correctly engaged with some of these parallelisms can help us achieve a greater depth and appreciation and understanding of the Torah, at least as per the thinking of the Rambam and the other great thinkers who went with him. And in Mitzvah Hashem next week, we'll look at some other examples we'll move away from this theory of the Rambam around slow change in the Torah, look at new topics, but hopefully in them we'll see some deeper insight into the Torah and what's going on. And I'll conclude for today here. I'm not giving my Gemara here today, so if anyone wants to hang on and ask live questions, you're most welcome to do. For once, I don't have to rush off. And in Mitzvah next week, this year we'll resume live in the shul again. But in the meantime, as always, thank you so much for joining. Sorry for the brief interruption in the middle.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zobin.